Alright guys, thanks for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like most people have started coming in. As I mentioned earlier, we do have cookies, but please try not to get up in the middle of the conversation and get a cookie. You can get one after we are finished. There's plenty up here, and I've heard that they're really good, so make sure you grab one. We have 3 speakers tonight. We were going to have 4, but one had to cancel because of the snow that we're supposed to be getting again. Another snowstorm coming our way. Good thing most of us live on campus because you just have to walk in it. You don't have to drive in it. So you're all okay. So today is all about conversations in the disciplines. And what does that mean? Literally what the title says. We're going to have a conversation within several different disciplines about how the research and writing happens within each discipline. And we have 3 very dynamic speakers, and they're going to present on the research that they do and show you how they do things. And so I know you're all very excited to be here, and I encourage you to take notes and not to play on your laptops with Facebook, because we know you would never do that, but I'm just going to throw it out there per chance you were thinking about it, okay? Our first speaker is going to be Lindsay Feist, and she's coming to us from Gender and Women's Studies. Our second speaker is going to be Anne DePrince, and she's coming to us from Psychology. And our final speaker is going to be Peter Hansen, and he's coming from Poli-Sci. So please give them your attention. And at the end of their discussion, we'll have time for questions. Hi. So, I guess, can you come loud? Of course you can hear me, right? Yes. I think I'm the only person who doesn't have a PowerPoint because when Kara said conversation, I was like, oh, then we'll just talk. So, and the other problem with that is that when we say conversations across the disciplines, I'm interdisciplinary and really react against disciplinary boundaries. And so in some ways, being a gender and women's studies scholar, depending on the day, I'm a historian, I'm a sociologist, I'm a critical race sex theorist, I'm a cultural media studies person. And so since I had to choose one, or at least to have hopefully a more focused conversation with you all, tonight I'm going to pretend to be a historian for a little bit. And I thought I would tell you a little bit about my training, where I come from, what I study, and the big thing, how I study, and then the most painful part of it all, which is writing. And I will be a full person to disclose. I think I have more of a writer's block, writer's panic than most of you combined, which is bad because I chose a profession where writing is how I get jobs and how I get judged pretty regularly. So first things first, my PhD is in American Studies. That's a fancy way of saying the critical study of American culture. And within the field of American Studies, I study consumer culture. So I study advertising, and more specifically, when I went to graduate school, was interested in studying how, quote unquote, American companies sold products around the world. So iconic things like Budweiser or McDonald's, when you see a Starbucks when you're studying abroad and you're like, yes, they have a bathroom with free toilet paper. But the idea being how these companies originally were able to appeal to people outside the United States. And so for a long time, I didn't know how to study that. And then I had to and then I discovered this thing called the corporate archive. And this is the part where I became a historian. And basically, I identified some places that house private corporate documents. So for you business majors out there, these are all the sort of written records that men in the 1950s used to sort of strategize their global takeovers, sort of how I say it. So I identified a company, Avon Cosmetics is what I ended up doing my dissertation on. And that basically meant that I lived in a museum and was surrounded by, if you think about it, it's kind of a weird number, but over 220 feet of linear boxed material. So imagine your dorm room stuffed with like 300 boxes of just stuff. And by stuff, it was everything from market research literature to pamphlets to advertisements. And so my, I guess, research writing skill was to figure out how to interpret 300 boxes worth of stuff into making some sort of clever, multifaceted, convincing argument in the world of globalization theory and consumer culture stuff. And so I think based on, I guess, the email about what you guys are in the middle of doing, that interpretive part of Writ 1133, where you're reading a text and you're like, oh, I have to think critically and come up with something. It's not just words on paper. Is more or less what I did for 6 years of graduate school, was reading other people's writing, other people's strategies, and I think part of that is, it's my job to sort of know my theoretical background and the critiques. But also, the fascinating thing about Avon is that they have 300 plus boxes of corporate materials. You put them in my hands, you get arguments about empire building, you get arguments about recruiting women as laborers, you get arguments about selling concepts of beauty and womanhood, and that's the gender studies person and the race studies person. If you go over to the Harvard Business School, where they use Avon's materials, you get a fascinating argument about how to enlist people around the world into direct selling. You get arguments about how corporate social responsibility policies fail or don't fail. And so here I have people that in many ways are ideologically very different than me, and we're using the same materials to craft very different arguments. And so that's, I think, if I'm part of the interpretive panel today, that's a lot of what historians do, is making arguments, connecting it with other literature, other theories out there, and then the dangerous, frightening, time-consuming part is writing about it. And so, how do I write? I'm the first one to say I'm a bad writer. I'm actually not a writer. I call myself a reviser. So if you've ever had me in class, I don't have a lot of sympathy for you if you give me a first draft, because I usually go through about 7. Granted, that's not your profession, and so hopefully you don't need 7 drafts to get somewhere. But the process of getting ideas out, and I think a lot of you maybe have the fear that you need to know your argument and you need to know exactly what you're going to say, and you've only allotted 2 hours of your Sunday night to get your writ paper in, so you best figure it out. And I think most people with good critical thinking skills will tell you that the thinking and the writing part is really time-consuming, And so for me, when I had these boxes of materials and I had an index and I kind of knew what I was looking for, but I didn't, and so after 4 months of living at a museum, and I only have a couple things, I basically would take construction, this is kind of embarrassing, but this is what works for me. I would take construction paper and I would have like a main idea, constructing a united state of consumption, which in my head was sort of one perspective I was looking at. And then I had another piece of construction paper, and I got out like markers, and I just started writing and drawing. If anyone's ever seen me at a coffee shop or a bar, I usually will have a napkin with stuff on it. It's the weird type B part of my personality that helps. And then I take these things and then I write. And by writing, I don't always have a thesis statement in mind, and I kind of have to tie myself to a chair because I'm really social, and being by myself in front of a computer is not my forte. But that's the process for me, and that process goes from getting ideas literally on paper to getting them in a computer to then printing and revising and rewriting, and yeah, that's kind of what I do. And I think right now a classic example is I have a chapter for my dissertation. It's 35 pages. It's horrible. I'm surprised anyone let me out of grad school. I look at it and I'm like really embarrassed. And now I'm trying to get it published, right? So I can keep my job here and all those other things that professional professors have to do. And so what I realized, much like when you probably turn a paper in and your writing professor is like, wow, that sentence, you're really getting at something. Why don't you expand on it? That's happening in my own world. I've got 35 pages and I've got about 3 paragraphs that I'm like, oh, that's the main idea. And so what am I doing? I'm doing the exact same thing I did when I started. I have taken those 3 sentences. I'm looking at Puerto Rico and selling Puerto Rican women Avon, and I have these on my apartment wall. I take them down when I have guests over because I don't want them to think I'm totally loony. And now I'm starting the same thing. So that is, I write on a wall, I sit down, I free write for a couple hours, I put it away, I print it off, I handwrite it. I go to a coffee shop because I can't stand being inside anymore, and I rewrite it, and I'm on about draft 5. I'm up to about 28 pages, and the idea is when I'm done with this draft, I'll have some of my friends who won't hurt my feelings too terribly, hopefully from grad school, look it over, because I'm nervous about sending it out to the big bad world of peer-reviewed publications. But once it's there, and that should be happening soon, my friends will look it over, I'll send it out, and I don't know if anyone's going to talk about what it needs to be academically published, but basically all of this blood, sweat, tears goes into a submission, and it gets reviewed by my peers who are higher up on the food chain than I am, and they will look it over, and it'll either be flat out rejected or it'll be sent back to me with suggestions, or which it will not be accepted on the first time around. But the idea being that the revision process will happen again, and so now I'm like, what, 16 revisions in maybe? And if I make all the changes and they find it appealing and intellectually sound, it might make its way into an academic peer-reviewed journal, which might make its way, in an ideal world, to ProQuest or whatever expanded academic stuff that you might one day read it. But the process behind that, I think my message to you is that I think sometimes you guys think that this is easy. For me, it's so incredibly difficult. It's psychologically traumatizing in some ways that make me think maybe I shouldn't have been a scholar writer. But that revising and figuring out who you are and your learning styles. I'm an extrovert. You're not going to see me in my house very much. You'll instead see me in public. I've gotten over the fact that I have brilliant friends who can write sentences and write 20 pages, and it's amazing and it's polished, while I'm like the remedial idiot who literally is like writing second grade sentences. But, you know, again, revision is how I've owned it. That's who I am as a writer. It's who I am as a thinker. And yeah, I think that's kind of, I don't know if Kara, that covers the kinds of things I'm supposed to be saying, but that's my process. And I think for people who are in history or the other humanities, reading and giving yourself time to think and giving yourself time to write is very different than maybe what some of our other presenters are. They are thinking too, but they might be doing it in different ways and not relying on construction paper to get them there. So, is that too long, too short? Okay, thank you very much for listening.
All right, good evening. Thanks for having me. Thank you very much for inviting me and for being here. I wanted to chat with you a bit tonight about writing about quantitative data, and in particular, my research focuses on violence against women and children. As Kara mentioned, I'm in the psychology department here at the university, and I spend a lot of time thinking about trauma and its consequences, things that happen in terms of child abuse, domestic violence, and so forth. When I think about writing for journals or book chapters, the thing that strikes me most is how very long the process takes, as Lindsay alluded to. That one article can actually represent months or even years of my life, which is in some ways a fairly daunting thing to think about. So when you start approaching a writing project that you know might not come to fruition until 3 years later, how does one even begin doing that? And I think how you begin to do that is actually a bit of a riddle. And the riddle for me as a quantitative researcher, wearing a quantitative hat, I do qualitative work as well, but I'm going to focus on my quantitative work tonight. It's a riddle where you have to start at the beginning and the end at the same time. And what I mean by that is, before I even interview a participant or design a survey or choose questionnaires to give out to somebody, I have to know where I want to end up at the end. And so I'm at the beginning and at the end at all points in the research at the same time. So I might know at the end of a project because I have funding where a grant funder wants certain answers, or I have particular things that I'm passionate about figuring out. I know at the end I want to be able to write about certain things. So for example, I might want to be able to write about whether the communities in which women live matter for their responses to trauma and violence. I might want to write about what the cognitive consequences, so what are the impacts on the brain of kids who experience violence or women who experience domestic violence. So I have to know where I want to end up so that I can figure out what methods, what steps do I need to take along the way. And that can look really different. It can look small or big depending on the question, depending on where I want to end up. If I want to end up writing about women's experiences of things like post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms after violence, and I want to understand something about their communities, it turns out I have to ask a host of questions along the way, and I have to be really systematic about it. I have to ask questions about who women are, about what happened to them, about how they responded to what happened to them, about neighborhood characteristics. I might end up using maps, I might end up using numbers, I might end up analyzing data in SPSS or Excel softwares that you might be learning about. I might also end up doing things like measuring people's reactions to a lab task, like a little game. The psychologists are always coming up with different games and sneaky ways to test things. And so I have to be thinking from the start about what methods answer my questions. So if I want to know about the cognitive consequences of trauma, I'm probably going to have to give people little school-like tasks to do. But I have to be thinking from the start that if you pick up a journal article on violence and suddenly you see somebody talking about reaction times, that might seem really weird to you as a reader. So as I'm figuring out the start and the end of my process, I'm also thinking about and planning for who's my audience going to be at different points in this project. Because it might not make sense to somebody who thinks they're reading about child abuse to suddenly see something took 3 milliseconds. Why would that matter? So as I'm designing the research, I'm also designing the rationale that I'm eventually going to give to my reader. This is why 3 milliseconds matters. This is why we should care that it takes kids exposed to trauma 3 milliseconds, but kids who weren't exposed to trauma only 1 millisecond. I'm already building the kind of understanding in my own mind of why these things are important so I can explain them later. So I spend all that time figuring out where I'm starting, where I want to go. Then I have to actually do something. In my research, I have to talk to bunches of people. We did one study recently that we wrapped up where we interviewed 236 women about their experiences of domestic violence that were reported to the Denver Police Department. And we talked to a range of women. They were diverse with regard to ethnicity. 72% identified with one or more ethnic minority groups. They were diverse with regard to age. They were from 18 to 63 years old experiencing violence, and on and on. And we got to spend 3 hours with women initially where we gave them questionnaires, we interviewed them, we asked them open-ended questions, closed-ended questions. We had all of these different strategies about how to try to get answers to those questions we wanted to write about at the end. We then were sitting on piles of data. Some of the data were numbers, some of the data were categories of things, some of the data were looking at women's changes over time, so we interviewed them again 6 months and 12 months later. So then we crunched lots of numbers to test our hypotheses, the questions we wanted to answer. And then we had all of these data in front of us in pretty graphs and colors and groups and things like that. And then we thought, well, we're finally getting to this writing part. So where do we, is now when we sit down and start writing. But remember the riddle, we're kind of at the start, at the end, all at the same time throughout the whole process. It turned out we started writing months ago. Because we were writing the minute we started putting together that survey packet, the minute we started figuring out what's the reason for asking these questions. I was taking notes along the way, we were writing down what surveys we were using, and lo and behold, those notes start translating themselves into the methods section of our paper. So be documenting things as you go. Be typing stuff out and keeping notes for yourself because you're actually writing even when you don't even think you're writing something for that final product. What I ended up having to do is essentially take these different puzzle pieces. I have what I wanted to do, what I actually did, what people said to me, and it's a bunch of puzzle pieces that I think about then having to fit into a particular shape. And that shape is actually like an old-fashioned hourglass. Because what I have to do in psychology writing is start with an introduction that's really broad, that tells a reader from any other discipline or my own discipline why what I'm doing matters. So that introduction has to be a really big picture. But then I have to, in the shape of the hourglass, start getting really specific and tell the reader what we did. That's all the notes I took along the way. What exactly did we ask women? How did we ask it? Who asked it? How long did it take to ask? And then we have to tell them even more details. This is the average of what women reported on this survey, or this is what they said in response to this question. So I get down into the nitty-gritty, and then in the discussion, I have to come back out again and interpret the data. Have you ever heard the saying, the data speak for themselves? Anyone heard that?
I've heard that.
Couple of you? They don't, right? Have you ever looked at it and has it ever shouted back at you? It probably hasn't. The data don't speak to them for themselves, we have to speak for them, and that's what the discussion is. It's this process of figuring out, what do I think the data mean? What are my best guess at how to understand these graphs and figures and things like that? So in this whole process, I have some rules of writing that I've developed for myself that I'll share quickly with you and hopefully it might be useful to you. My first rule is be flexible about any of your rules about writing. Because even when you're working with something like graphs and figures and t-tests and that statistical analyses, things that sometimes people, I'm shocked to find out, sometimes people think might be boring, because it never is. You really need to leave room to be surprised, wowed, dumbfounded, creative, because the data don't speak for themselves. You give them voice. And that process of trying to understand why two groups differ from one another at the end of a study can be a really challenging, creative thing as you're writing. So be flexible in how you're thinking, be creative. Another rule of writing, I think, is write anywhere, anytime. Sometimes I hear people talk about, students say, Lindsay referenced, the infamous 7 to 9 p.m. on Sunday night when you decide you're going to get something done before a good movie comes on. And I think that's like the biggest Achilles heel for all of us, is thinking there's some perfect time. Some days I'll even manage to keep a whole day open, and I'll think that's the day I'm going to write. And you know what happens? If that's the only time that week I left to write, and I wake up with a headache, it's just a lost cause, or something goes wrong, or the power goes out. So write anywhere, anytime, but know what your preferences are. I'm a better writer in the morning. It's best if I just write, get a chunk of writing done. I'm terrible after 3 p.m. You all who write it, send papers in at midnight. I don't even know how to operate then. But I can generally write well in the morning. So I know where my strengths are, but I just make writing part of my day-to-day life. If I have 15 minutes, I can write a few sentences. My other rule of writing is that the first draft is for me. So the first draft is how I figure out my way through the forest of whatever data I'm dealing with. And the path I need through the forest, it needs to inspire me, speak to me. It's just for me. It's not for anybody else. And in fact, what the reader needs is probably a really different way of describing, maybe even a different platform, a different structure than I needed. So that first draft is entirely for me. As Lindsay referred to, the other zillion drafts, because there are a lot of them, are for the reader. And that's where you really fine-tune your arguments for them. Because, remember, they're wondering, why did you measure this? Why did you do that? I have a sense of that, and then I have to translate my path through the forest into something they'll understand so they can get to the same place I did. My other rule of writing is that you have to edit, revise, 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 and then edit some more. And I think of this as the nose rule. And I think dog noses are a lot cuter than people noses, so I put a dog nose up there. And the nose rule is you literally need to lead your reader through your paper by the nose. So if you imagine a dog where you put a bunch of treats across the house, they'll follow those treats and they'll end up right where you want them in their kennel or whatever you want them to do. That's what you want to do with the reader. At the end of one sentence, they should be able to sniff out and know exactly what's coming in the next sentence. So that's how I try to write to the reader. Here's the path through the forest. You just have to keep sniffing your way through. I'm going to give you each little crumbs at each step to get you there. My other rule of writing is get and stay inspired because it's a long haul. And so for me, I feel an accountability to the people who have participated in my research. So I think about wanting to tell their story well, wanting to live up to that social contract with them, that they shared something with me, and it's my responsibility, it's a huge responsibility to translate that out to the world. I also think about staying inspired in terms of the kind of music that helps me write, silly things maybe. Chocolate as a reward for getting a section done. I do a lot of walking and thinking about my writing with my dog with the big nose, because walking helps me think through problems, think about how to explain things. I know that classical music helps with some writing, jazz helps with other, and there's some days when nothing does it like Ozo Motley. So just figure out what music inspires you for different places you might get stuck in your writing, or different rewards for yourself. Then finally, when I have something, a zillion drafts down that I'm ready to share, I get tons of feedback. I get feedback from my community partners that I'm working with, from my students, from collaborators. And so this is just a sense of some people who gave me feedback on one paper that was part of this project on domestic violence. So you can't be shy. You have to put your ideas out there and brace yourself for feedback and know the product will be better for it. Then, after all of that, you can't clutch. You have to eventually submit something. You have to let the paper fly. You have to toss it out into the world. As Lindsay alluded to, in my world, we toss it out for peer review, so other psychologists, often psychologists, sometimes folks from other professions, evaluate my work. They never accept anything on the first try, as an almost a rule. And so you get feedback. You make it better, you build a tougher skin, you realize this isn't your baby, it's just a piece of work. And then eventually it ends up in black and white, you feel very proud of yourself, and I wanted to just make a note that you always remember in your writing to say thank you to the tons of people along the way who helped you get to this point. We also think a lot in my research group about audience, so we write for professional journals. We also write for our community partners and people in Denver who might not be psychologists. So we do a newsletter every quarter in order to translate some of our research findings out into language that's more accessible to folks. So if you want to know more about our work, you can visit our website, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, hi everybody. I'm Peter Hansen from the Political Science Department. I'm not going to sound nearly as smart as Anne just did, but I will try. I'll do my best here. A lot of what Anne said about psychology and the way she goes about writing in psychology is true for political science as well. They're both social sciences. They're both disciplines in which there's something going on out in the world and we're trying to understand it. And we're trying to understand it by collecting data, asking interesting questions, talking to people, and ultimately then going back and trying to analyze all of that to come up with some answers. And we don't even really start the writing process until we've done all of that work in advance. So I've outlined some of the same steps that Anne just talked about. And the first one is to find an interesting puzzle. That's often easy to do. Sometimes it's really hard to do. You have to find something that you're really, really intrigued by. Something where you've been sitting in class and a question came up and you weren't able to answer it. You know, something going on in the world that that you're wondering about. Well, for me, I'm a political scientist. I was always interested in politics. We talked about it around the table when I was a kid. I thought about it when I was in college. And after I graduated, I decided to go to Washington, and I ended up working in the Senate. And I got really curious about the Senate. And so when I went to graduate school, that's what I decided to study. I wanted to learn more about Congress. I wanted to learn more about the Senate. So I'll talk more about that puzzle in a second. But once you identify what that puzzle is, you start then to generate some hypotheses. Well, what might be some answers to this puzzle? How would we figure out what some solutions to it might be? Once you do that, and this is what we do as social scientists, we have to figure out the kinds of data and the methods we need to use in order to test it. And, you know, if you talk to political scientists, there's sort of a fight about how to do this, right? Some people are, the quantitative geeks, right? They want to sit in front of their computer all the time. They want to, type into data. They want to write code. They want to gather reams of data and analyze that. Other people go to the other extreme. They say that's the wrong approach. Like, you need to be talking to people. You need to go interview politicians. You need to go interview activists, interview people in interest groups. My philosophy, and I think this is actually the philosophy of most people, is that you use the tools you need to answer your question. Like, whatever your question is, there's a way to get to the answer. And you have to try and use the kind of tools that are going to be appropriate to that. So I'll talk about what I've done in my project in a second. Then you collect your data, you test your hypotheses, and then at the end you write up your results. You've done all of this work first, really before the writing process even starts. Interestingly though, that's when the hard work really begins, because you've got your data, you've started writing, and that process of writing and thinking and redrafting and editing can go on for a really long time. You've heard my colleagues talk about how long their projects have taken. I'm working on a book that I really started probably in 2004. And I've been thinking about it for that long. If you're guessing I'm ready to be done thinking about this book, you'd be right. So hopefully soon it will actually be nearly complete. So here's my puzzle. My puzzle was, to what extent can the majority party in the Senate shape legislative outcomes in that chamber? How powerful is the Senate majority party? Is the Senate stuck in gridlock, as you read about in the newspaper? Can they actually solve problems? And it's an important question because we've got so many serious problems. Right? We've got climate change to deal with. We've got the long-term budget crisis to deal with. We've got access to higher education, all these kinds of things that Congress needs to take care of. This was something people talked about a lot when I worked in the Senate. And the fear was, and I was working in the minority most of the time. And in the minority, we were really worried that the majority was figuring out how to steamroll us. And we'd be in strategy sessions, once a week, and all the members would get together and they'd be talking, and they'd say, they're trying to turn this place into the House of Representatives. Right? In the Senate, that's the worst possible thing you can say. Right? The House, it's like your little brother, right? That's that's the little sibling. The House, you rule in an iron fist. They call it the gulag because the majority does whatever it wants. In the Senate, that's not how it works. In the Senate, every member is supposed to have the right to debate, the right to shape legislation. So there was a traditional view that I was heard about, that I'd read about. This is what most political scientists would think, that the majority has little power because of two things. One, the right of the minority to filibuster, and the second is the right of the minority to offer unlimited numbers of amendments. But I had an alternative view, and I had a suspicion that the majority party actually has pretty good ways to clamp down on amending on the Senate floor. This place that's supposed to be freewheeling, the Senate's been called the world's greatest deliberative body. I had a suspicion that actually the majority can clamp down on it pretty well. And my hypothesis, I spelled it out for you there, was that they do that. I wanted to test that by looking at the way Congress handles the annual spending bills. So every year we have to fund the government. They pass 12 bills to do this. But sometimes they don't pass 12. Sometimes they might pass 6. Sometimes they might pass 5. And they don't bring these other bills to the floor. Instead what they do is they package them together behind the scenes to create one huge monster appropriations bill. And they bring that to the floor instead. And my suspicion was when they do that, what they're actually doing is suppressing the right senators have to amend. I thought it was much harder to amend these monster bills than it would be to deal with each one of them individually. Well, to test this, I wanted to use two different methods. I wanted to have two tools to do this. One method was going to be to conduct interviews. I wanted to go talk to politicians. The other one, though, was that I had to use some quantitative tools. I wanted to figure out if there were patterns I could discern over time. So I went out and I collected 35 years of data from the Senate. I tracked every single spending bill that had been debated in Congress during that 35-year time period. I hired a research assistant who's now a junior here, who turns out to be a computer genius, and he figured out how to count all the votes that had taken place on amendments during that 35-year period. He figured this out in like an hour. He's so much smarter than me. So I gathered all that data, and I started to pick up some interesting information. Right. First thing I did, I went and interviewed Trent Lott. There's our little picture together. And he was a former majority leader of the Senate. And he gave me some interesting intuition. He said, as the years went by, appropriations bills became the magnet or opportunity for each side of the aisle to make political statements by forcing votes on controversial issues that were unrelated perhaps to the appropriations bill that was pending, discouraging the leaders on either side from wanting to bring the appropriations bills up, because your members then had to cast tough, unnecessary political and irrelevant votes on amendments quite often. In other words, if you bring the bills to the floor, the other side's going to make you take tough votes. Right? You know, from Lott's perspective, he had, and I've looked at the era he's talking about, the Democrats were trying to embarrass him right and left. You know, bring things to the floor that would make the Republicans look really bad. And so the strategy was simple. Well, we just won't bring the bills to the floor. We're going to create one of these monster packages, which is much harder to amend. Well, that's interesting, but just one quote with Trent Lott, even though he's got a lot of experience, that's not going to persuade anybody in political science. They want to see data over time, right? Does the data bear this out? So I started collecting data, as I said. I just want to show you a little bit of it. First thing I did was I tried to figure out, well, how often are they skipping votes on these appropriations bills and not bringing them to the floor? Well, this is what it looked like. This is the percent or the proportion of them that were now brought to the floor. And the data was pretty messy. It didn't look like there were any real patterns. There was this funny gap in the middle. It bounced up and down. So that was piece of information number one. But then I wanted piece of information number two. I wanted to know, well, what's happening with amendments? How many amendments are being voted on? Can I see evidence that that's being suppressed? So I gathered that. Well, that was pretty noisy too. There wasn't a whole lot obvious to see there. Remember Ann's comment, you know, do the data speak for themselves? Well, not obviously here, when I looked at it this way. But what happens when I look at both of these things simultaneously? What happens when I try and figure out what happens to amending when the majority decides to skip votes on these spending bills? Well, I just put those two things together. So on the bottom axis there, on the horizontal axis, that's the proportion of bills each year that were not brought to the floor for full debate. And on the vertical axis, we have the total number of votes on amendments that occurred. Well, now some patterns are starting to emerge. Right? Now if I fit a line to this data, I actually see that this strategy Trent Lott was talking about, skipping debate on spending bills in favor of creating these monster packages, actually has a pretty significant effect. It dramatically reduces the right senators have to offer amendments. Now this isn't supposed to be able to happen. If you read any book about the Senate, the first thing they say to you is that there's no good way to prevent senators from offering amendments. That's what makes the chamber distinctive. But here the majority had figured something out, right? They figured out a strategy that no one had really recognized. And that became clear when looking at the data in this way. Now, this is intended to frighten you. So to take that step process even farther, I showed you a relationship between two variables. Well, I had to know if it was really true, right? I had to see how well it would stand up. And so what I did is I came up with every variable I could think of that might explain this relationship. And I put them into what's called a regression together. I tested them all together. And what I discovered was that the relationship I thought was present was really there. That the majority really was able to reduce amendments in the way I was suspecting. So what did I learn from this whole process? Well, I've shared with you some of my conclusions here. You know, that whole process of gathering information gave me evidence. It was like putting a murder mystery together. Right? The first piece of evidence came from the interviews, you know, where politicians said, this is the strategy we're using. The second piece of information came from my quantitative analysis. It was consistent with what those politicians were telling me. And so what that told me then was the balance of evidence I had. I didn't have a single smoking gun, but the balance of evidence I had supported this hypothesis about how the majority was able to crack down on the Senate floor. After I put all of that together, that's really when the writing process started. That makes it sound pretty simple, though. That makes it sound like I just got the data, sat down, and wrote it up. That wasn't how it worked at all. I actually started that writing process, probably, I don't know, maybe about 2007, somewhere around there. I started it in grad school. I finished grad school in 2010, and at that time I turned in a dissertation, and I was like, at last, I'm done. And my advisor said, well, this is really good, but you're about halfway there. And since I've arrived at DU then, I've been continuing to work on that, continuing to shape that book. And now it's basically, it's at a point where it's done. It's out, the publisher's looking at it now. It's right on the verge, I think, of being finished, but it's taken a long time. The final point I want to make is that can be really, that process can be hard on me. Because part of the writing process is taking your writing and showing it to other people. You know, what I do, I bring it to conferences, I present it to my peers. I give presentations about drafts of my book, you know, pieces of it. What then happens is I get beat up. Right? My colleagues listen to me and they pile on. You know, and I've had to learn to have a thick skin. People have listen to my writing. The benefit of that is it has dramatically improved my book. If I hadn't put it out there, if I hadn't let other people read it, right? If I hadn't been willing to subject myself to that criticism, my book would be so much weaker than it is today. And I know when all of you guys have done you've been in your FSAMs or you've been in your writing classes, you've done peer editing, and you feel so vulnerable when you turn your writing over to someone else to read. That's exactly how we feel. But the benefit of doing that is it really gives you a better product in the end. So I'm going to stop there. And can you talk about that?
All right, so at this time, because it is called a conversation, we're going to have a conversation. So I'm going to invite my three speakers up to sit up here. And I encourage you guys to ask them questions or comments, or if you want to know more about some of the things that they are talking about, go ahead and direct them this way. Does anyone want to get us started? Yes, Jenny, I knew it. Throw it out there.
All right. So I guess this is for all of you and all of the research that you've conducted. I was just wondering, I think you were talking about Avon Cosmetics and how, Harvard Business actually goes through the same topic as you. I was just wondering if you ever read the other works of people doing the same topic as you, and if that ever changes your perspective or how you approach the topic.
I would say that's part of our job is to read that's the difference between maybe what you're doing at an undergraduate level and us doing as quote unquote experts, is that it is your job and just to be a good thinker, but absolutely. And part of it is reading it, and I think understanding what you're saying, and then the really big part is also engaging in how you might differ. And so I don't tend to run in the same circle with Harvard Business people, but I have all of their files on my computer, and I would much like you mentioned earlier that makes your writing better too, is really getting a handle on what other people are saying. So,
No, that's exactly what we do. I read a lot of books on the Senate before I started mine, a lot of articles. And what you try and do is find a question that hasn't been answered yet, or find a puzzle that you think has been addressed incompletely, or maybe people have missed something. And so you always try and situate your own work within what other people have done, and that way you connect it to a larger body of knowledge about the thing you're trying to understand.
The other thing that sometimes doesn't seem obvious is if somebody's writing about something and they have a different perspective from you, or they disagree with you, you might want to just turn a blind eye to that. I don't want to read that because that might, we might not, it might be controversial or something. That's exactly who you want to be reading, because thinking about how you would have essentially papers are a conversation, they're a very slow conversation across different researchers, because we talk back and forth to one another through papers. So it's the very people who might disagree with you or have a really different perspective. You want to be reading their work as passionately and as often as people who agree and are doing similar work to yours.
Jackie?
I think it was Peter that said find a question that hasn't been answered. So what's your advice for the students that have to write a research paper within 3 weeks.
That's the hardest thing. You know, oftentimes, the kind of original research that we've been talking about is a process that takes really many years. You know, what you have the opportunity to do in class is to find a question that intrigues you. And you know, there will almost certainly be other people who have done work on it. And you know, in a 10-week class, you can see what other people have done. You may have time actually to go out and gather some additional information yourself and make a contribution. You know, some of the writing you do at DU, the history department, for example, does a great job of this, right? In the history department, everybody writes a thesis. And your senior year, you have I think it's a 2-quarter class where you put together a 60-page paper and you go up and do original work. But it takes that 2 quarters in order to do a project like that. So there are ways to do it. You probably won't have a chance to do it in a typical class.
Thank you.
Hannah?
What is the most important part of the writing process? Maybe for you, like each of you individually. You have your own specific biases, I guess, or what is most important?
Sitting down and writing, which is for me. I mean that literally.
Like the first draft part?
No, I mean like getting in front of a computer, and I think in our world we can read and ask questions and go to conferences and talk, but I mean literally getting words from here to a computer. I don't mind revising. I mean, now that I'm like, okay, that's my thing and I just need to own it, but literally getting words from my head into a 20-page format. And that's what I mean, like writer's block, writer's fear, and so that for me is the hardest thing, and that's a disciplinary thing and a personality thing, because I would much rather be teaching or interacting with people, and writing can be very lonely, and some people are great at it, and I think great academics like thrive on that, and I am not that personality type, and that took a lot of self-awareness for me to realize that doesn't mean I can't be good at it, it just means I have to have some strategies about being disciplined, and yeah, that's a really lame answer, but literally this for me is the hardest part sometimes, so.
I'm struck by a lot of things Lindsay's saying, and too, I think Lindsay's being fabulously humble. I think many of us, even those who maybe seem very introverted and like they would love to sit in front of a computer and just write forever, struggle with similar things. And those people don't do what Peter talked about, get out there at conferences and share their work. So everybody's got an Achilles heel to the process. And it sounds like share a lot in common with what our Achilles heel is. I think the most important part of the process is getting feedback, getting from that first draft that's from me to the next draft that I'm ready to share. And as Peter said, that can be kind of a vulnerable process because you send it off and I think, wow, I'm a grown-up and I've achieved a lot in life and I'm so scared to send this piece of paper off and have somebody, I need to send it to the most honest person possible so that I get the most honest feedback possible, and that's the most important thing I can do.
I agree with all that. One final thing I would say is you really have to have finished your research mostly before you get started with writing. You have to basically know what you're going to say. Have a good idea where you want to go. Second, this is really simple. You've got to be awake, right? That's why I write the best in the morning. Once I start to get tired, something that would take me 5 minutes suddenly takes half an hour. You know, I go back and look at work I wrote when I'm tired, and I'm just sort of embarrassed at ridiculous typos. I make obvious mistakes. And so you've got to block out some time when you know you're going to be focused. And then finally, you just have to be ready to revise again and again and again. And, you know, again, I've been revising this project for years, trying to get it right. You know, you won't do that through class, right? But even revising it once will improve a lot over where it started.
Yes, Melissa.
The students in my class are researching and writing in teams, and I wondered if you could spend some time talking about any experience you've had with co-authorship or collaborative authorship.
I've only only ever written one paper by myself. All of my papers, well, separate from like in school, I did my own work and all that, but things that I published have all been with teams. And so I've had some of the best experiences ever in those collaborations where when we're in sync, we really complement one another. We can assign different parts of the paper. We can, you always have somebody to look at who has a new, fresh set of eyes. And then I've had some of the most frustrating experiences ever where a collaborator that I adore, I think the world of this person, she and I write so differently. Like her path through the forest, I'm pretty sure it's in the suburbs. Like I don't even know. We don't even speak the same language. So I know when she and I are working together, the end product's going to be great because we have to explain so much to one another along the way that there wouldn't be anybody who wouldn't understand ultimately what we were talking about. But getting there, it's just, I know it's going to be a bigger time commitment versus somebody that we write really similarly. We may get out of the gate faster and it might feel easier, but we probably are going to get more feedback in that peer review process because we played each other's strengths and we didn't notice our vulnerabilities.
I haven't ever co-authored. I don't know if that's because I'm too much of a control freak or what it is. I kind of like working on things by myself. That said, I suspect I could produce a whole lot more if I was teaming up with other people. Seth Maskett, who is my colleague in the political science department, has a lot of publications, and one of the reasons is he teams up with people. And having the skills to do that is tremendously helpful. I once had a professor of mine describe it as co-authoring as being like a bad marriage or something like that. Like you're constantly trying to work together, but you're bickering and you can't, you're stuck together, right? You've got to figure it out. I don't know. I haven't done it myself, but that's just.
I haven't done it in years, and it was with my advisor, and so there's a power dynamic in that relationship that might be different than what you all have to deal with. I also, I think 4 eyes thinking about something, but I think it comes down to the nuts and bolts of communication and expectation and deadlines and being honest and being accountable. So like any good relationship, like letting the other person know who you are, and not lying about missing your deadline or, but that would be just sort of common sense how you would treat a significant person in your life. It's probably the best piece of advice, I think, for team writing, so.
What kind of advice can you give to someone that has to somehow find their way of wading through all the massive data that we can find as students and actually find the information that they want for their paper?
Go to the research center and learn how to use keywords. That's honestly, I think you guys spin your wheels. And a lot of the time you might want to study something and there's a buzzword in our field that you don't know yet. And then you find that word and you put it in your search box with your advanced thing and all of a sudden 25 articles pop up. And that to me is something that, being relatively new to you, that the research center can help you find what kinds of stuff. Because I think that there's people in all different fields are studying similar things and talk about them in different ways, which is one of the maybe not great things about academics. We can be really, really specific sometimes. But I really think for you all, I came from a university that did not have a research center, and so to really have someone sit down and do that keyword search, you'll save yourself hours. You really will. So is that kind of what you were asking?
Yeah, just good advice on how to wade your way through. Because you all mentioned how you started with a massive amount of data,
Yeah.
and finding what you need throughout that.
I think the other piece is getting really specific with the puzzle you're interested in. So if you frame the puzzle, I gave you some really big puzzle examples of what's the relationship between the brain and violence. That would be a terrible place to start. That may be your overall passion, but the more specific you can get with your question, it'll help you figure out which data are the most important, either in your own data that you've collected or in what you need to read in the literature. So being really precise and specific. In psychology, we talked about operationalizing variables. So I take the couple variables I'm interested in and I come up with a really constrain them to say, what I mean by violence for this study is women between the ages of 18 and 25 who are exposed to dating violence. Already I've narrowed what I mean. So do that narrowing early.
I have a related question. We've been talking about research questions and hypotheses in my class as well. And I've heard actually the social scientists talk about starting with a question as well as a hypothesis. And so I'm curious about the relationship between the two, because I was taught in sort of my more qualitative humanities discipline to start with a question. So I'm curious about that relationship.
I think in psychology we might have an overarching question like what is the relationship between these two things? But before we dive in, because you can cheat and make data say sometimes whatever you want them to, we take that question and try to say from the front end, based on what people have done before, what I've done before, my hypothesis is not that just that these things are related, but that this is related to this in a particular way. So you use that question to say, here's the big picture, and then the hypothesis to say this is the particular thing before people get the data that I'm predicting.
Yeah, our process is really very similar. So there will be an overarching question describing the direction of the research, and then when I actually get down to the point of analyzing the data, I will develop a set of hypotheses that tell me exactly what I should expect to see, if it's true. Right? So what should the data look like if the hypothesis is true, and that's just really a way of giving yourself some confidence in yourself.
Well, I have a question, and my students should sit up and pay attention. They don't know this yet, but they're going to do a remediation for their final project. And Anne, you talked specifically about taking an article for one audience, and then you essentially remediated it for the website and a new audience. So can you talk a little bit about how you did that and the different approaches to it?
Well, I do a lot of research with community partners, so I work with the police department or service agencies dealing with violence. And so they have a lot of research questions. They have questions that I can couch in research terms and try to help them find answers. But what I've learned over time is a professional, my psychology audience, they care about what exact questions did you ask, what were the average responses, what were the particular stats tests you did, and all of that detail is really important for that academic paper. For my partners, they trust that I did that stuff along the way, and they don't care as much about those details. They care that the work was well done and rigorous. They don't want junk science. But that's not what's most useful to them. What's useful to them is what are the practice implications? How does this finding relate to the real world? So the process I go through is I take that peer-reviewed article, which is essentially my contract with my partner. Like, we did good science. It got reviewed by our peers. We got a stamp of academic approval, so you can count on what I'm about to tell you. And then I focus in on, here are the things that I can change the world in Denver. Just yesterday, I took an article that a student of mine was a first author on, and I was her supporting author, so we wrote it together, but she took the lead. And she looked at what women said about their interactions with the police after domestic violence, and she found that some of the interactions the women had with the police officers actually predicted women's PTSD symptoms, which is fascinating to think cops can do something that would help or potentially make it harder for women after PTSD. Yesterday I got a chance to present to the chief of police of Denver and his command staff, and they all have guns and stuff. So next time you do a presentation, I just want you to remember no one has hopefully guns in the room. And that's the real challenge, just to keep it cool then. But what I was able to do for them is skip all that heavy stat stuff and go to, here's what you need to know, here's what I think this work tells us about what you need to know when you're training new officers. So I try to think about what's the most important message to the audience, but that doesn't mean it's the watered down message, it just means I explain the other science things in a different context.
Have either of you done something similar that you could talk about?
One of the things that's going on in political science right now is tremendous growth in blogging. And the reason is that, so we just went through an election, and all the media pundits, will start talking about what they think is happening in our election system, what's causing polarization, all this kind of stuff. And of course, for years, political scientists have had very good answers to those questions, but we've done a terrible job of communicating those findings to the rest of the country. And so, in the last probably 5 years or so, then the goal of writing blogs has been to inform people in the media, politicians, members of the public, about what political scientists know about the political problems our country has. So I'll give you one example. Everyone knows many people know that Congress is very polarized, right? Parties are farther apart than they've been in 100 years. Well, one of the most common explanations you hear for this is gerrymandering. Political parties are manipulating the boundaries of congressional districts, and they're doing that in a way that makes the parties more polarized. Now, actually, this has really been studied a lot. We know it's not true. There's a lot of reasons to believe it's not true, but just a simple test of it is the fact that the Senate is also polarized, and you can't gerrymander states. So we know something else has to be going on. Well, the ability to communicate our findings to the public and the media in a way that they can understand really informs our political dialogue. And you can actually see that in the last election. So if you read the Washington Post or you read the New York Times, someone like Ezra Klein in the Washington Post would be quoting political scientists. He'd be debunking some of the falsehoods that were out there in the media. Or Nate Silver in the New York Times. If you're an election junkie, you know that Nate Silver was predicting what the election results would be. Well, he's using political science methods. He's doing it in this brilliant way that conveys the importance of research to the public.
Which brings up an interesting question, and I know a lot of my students have asked me this. What do you think about using blogs as sources for your own research?
Well, you have to be careful, right? You have to make sure it's a trusted source. That's going to be the single biggest challenge. Anybody can blog. Right? So, I think we could all probably point to the blogs that we trust. But you have to be very careful about what source you choose to rely on.
I think for me, what you can use blogs, especially doing sort of feminist critiques of things, there are smart, sassy critiques out there, and you can maybe get a finger on a pulse of how people outside the academy are talking and what they're talking about, but I wouldn't say using that as, for me, a peer-reviewed source, but instead sort of gauging what people are onto. So for example, really classic thing is you all love to show me the Dove campaign for real beauty and talk about how it's amazing and its progress, and I love to come back at you about selling you, health and whatnot. Feminist bloggers have been critiquing the Dove campaign for beauty, and yet clearly Dove campaign for beauty is getting traction with a different kind of audience. And so for me, the idea is that a good, smart scholar will say, okay, clearly there's something that's being talked about, but using it for a source. And if you're in my class, you can't use it as a source, because I make you pay it forward to people who spent years and years and years in graduate school as peer-reviewed academic experts, so to speak. That doesn't mean they're not important, that they don't say something, that a trend is being talked about. So.
Yeah, we can't cite blogs in my work, so you can in my classes,
You can in mine. Just let any of you ask. But they should know your point. Any other questions or comments?
Could I say one more thing to the person over here who was saying, if I only have 3 weeks, what should I? One really neat thing for the long haul of thinking about your BU education is to think about how you'll develop that question across other experiences here. You might have a small piece you do in a 3-week class, but it comes to mind that I had a student in an FSEM 4 years ago now she's a senior. She got really passionate about the things we were writing about and talking about. She did a little research project that was bite-sized in our 10-week class. But then she joined my research team, and she has been an RA in the group, and now she's doing an honors thesis, and she's figured out really her own questions, and she's brought her own voice to the kind of science we do in my group. And she's now doing a project that's helping Project PAVE, which is this community organization understand these research questions they have, and she's going to get to present to their board of directors in addition to writing up her thesis. So it's really fantastic. I had another student who got bit by the research bug, enjoyed learning about writing about science. She graduated a couple years ago, but we kept working on a paper together. She's first author on an article that just got accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. So, and that reflects the work she did at BU. Part of it was a PINS project. She got PINS money to go present it at a conference. So think about other classes where you might follow research questions and writing projects, and then other experiences like working with a faculty member. Think about PINS as a resource, because you really can build a lot while you're here. You have 3 weeks in one class, but you have 4 years in the bigger picture.
One thing I'd like each of you to expand a little bit on, you just talked about it quickly, is methods that you use. Perhaps maybe not so much detail on the textual or discourse analysis, but maybe interviews, observations, something that, because I know a lot of them have to go out into the field and conduct things like this, so you could talk a little bit more on methods.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing is you use the method that's appropriate to answer your question. So that's going to be different for every kind of project. I have a student right now whose senior thesis is trying to figure out if the debate over birth control in the Obama healthcare bill had an effect on Catholic voters in the election. One piece of data he's trying to find is he's trying to find Barack Obama's approval ratings over time among Catholics and try to see if any dips or movement in them is associated with major moments in the debate over birth control. That's just one particular method he's using to try and answer that question. He also went out and he interviewed probably 10 or 12 nuns, priests, officials from the Catholic Church to get their perspective on this. So he used 2 methods which were appropriate to getting the answer.
One thing I would throw out, I mean, in addition to sort of doing discourse analysis of what documents, what conversations are happening within documents, is I work a lot with visual culture, which is sort of the same thing as so if you are looking at advertisements or you're looking at music videos, and there's a whole school of complex theories about how to go about that. But one of the ways, I think for an undergraduate level, is doing what we call content analysis. So looking for specific things that happen. So if you're going to watch a music video and you want to see how many times in a rap video a woman is shaking her ass, you can literally count that, right? I mean, so there are things within visual culture. It's true, and you should, because there's a lot, says the women's studies professor, right? But so in that sense, I think looking at images as evidence, again, there's a lot of complex things, but I think if you are, visual culture is an exciting place to be able to make, in my world, cultural arguments that are pretty powerful, I think, so.
As a psychologist, we love people, but we're really suspicious of them. So we try to combine methods in case people lie to us or don't really know the truth about themselves. And so we try to think about that in their method. So if you were reading a book right now and I asked you to tell me approximately how many times your eyes went, if you're reading left to right, how many times your eyes backtrack, you'd tell me, 2 or 3 times across the course of the page. You're not actually trying to lie to me. You're just not aware that your eyes are jumping around all the time as you're reading. So there are some things people can't know in an interview. So we sometimes use interviews and self-report questionnaires for things that people are good reporters about, like how are you feeling today, and things like that. And then we try to use other methods to get at stuff that might be outside of people's awareness or might be difficult for them to report on. I think it's probably true in political science too, that people like to tell you what they think you want to hear. So if you ask people, did you vote? Everybody voted. But if you actually look
Voting
at
for the winner.
yeah, but if you actually look at voting records, they did. I don't think they all voted.
That's correct.
And in psychology, we see the same thing. So we also try to think about if I'm interviewing someone, maybe I don't ask what they think about sexual assault because everybody's going to tell me it's bad, but I ask, what does your peer group say, or what do your friends say? So even within a single method, you want to think creatively about that method. You might not just always ask straight at a particular question.
Yes. Bouncing off of that question, can you give more detail on how to maybe go about conducting a good interview that will actually get you some good research?
great question. You know, I think it's, you know, very helpful ahead of time to, you know, what your goals for the interview are. What are you trying to get at? Come up with a list of questions that are helping you get there. But I think it can often be helpful to ask, at least in political science research, to ask some pretty open-ended questions. You don't never want your question to guide the person to a particular answer. So you ask it in a way that just encourages them to talk. And that can actually lead you to some really interesting discoveries, because you may find that your conceptions you brought into the interview might have been mistaken. And so there's this balance between having your eye on the goal, sort of knowing where you want the interview to go and trying to push it in that direction, but also being open to the fact that you're going to be surprised and be willing to follow that if it seems fruitful.
We try to do a lot on top of absolutely all of, absolutely years that on top of that, we try to set up questions so that we decrease social desirability, or the tendency for people to just tell you what they think you want to hear. So we'll do things like set up questions saying, some people think X, other people think Y, how about you? To really tell people, I'm open to hearing whatever your perspective is. So I think there are ways you can be really inviting and normalizing of people's responses. And then I think thinking about your style in the interview is really important too. So if I'm focused on my piece of paper and I'm nervous and I'm talking like a robot, that may be more difficult for people to feel really jazzed and energized. And the more you can have a conversation, it feels like a conversation to people, I think that helps them kind of open up and tell you more unexpected, interesting things.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just maybe even having a couple throwaway questions at the beginning, because not putting your main questions at the beginning, but getting people to talk. And then when you are in that conversation, that they are more comfortable with you, rather than getting right at the main point.
Have some good canned jokes too that you can sell as if they're not canned. Like, we ask people how much money they make, which people are surprisingly sensitive about. We ask them about like violence and all this stuff, and they're more sensitive about how much money they make. So I always say things like, I'm going to ask you about how much money you make. I won't understand how much economic stress women are under. And don't worry, I'm not going to try to sell you any magazines or T-shirts at the end of this interview. People always giggle, and then we all feel better about me now finding out they hardly make any money. So think about how you can use humor and other things to be professional in your interview, but really human too with people.
Okay, so to wrap up, could you each give one piece of advice to all of them? One thing to leave them with as they go about their own research.
You know, don't be afraid to show your work to other people. Be ready to hear criticism and make revisions, and just keep at it, because that's how it gets better.
I would say it's okay if you see yourself as a reviser. I think revising stuff is my own thing. Your writing gets better the more you practice it. So I think sharing, and that's time management, it takes more time, and especially if you don't like writing, that's not fun, but your end product will be so much better. So revise.
I would keep your eyes on the prize in terms of your writing really can make a difference, whether it's in your own life or the people you're writing about or the topics you're writing about. And when you have a good writing day and you realize your writing's going to do that, I think there's nothing more powerful in the world. So keep that in mind too. We talked about this in the dark side and the vulnerable and the hard parts, but boy, when it goes right, it's really good.
Thank you. All right, everybody, thanks so much for coming. Please grab a cookie on the